Hi, Ashley here with HeartHookHome.com, and today we are going to learn my favorite way of joining two pieces of crochet using the slip stitch method. This is particularly helpful when you are joining two squares that are not necessarily the same exact size or have the same number of stitches. This is an excellent way to join these squares for an Afghan project, granny square project, a stitch sampler blanket, or anything that has squares that are similarly sized but may not have the same number of stitches. First things first, you're going to want to take all of your crocheted squares and lay them out on the floor in the way that you would like them to be assembled for your finished project. One thing that I highly recommend is taking a picture on your cell phone or otherwise of the squares exactly laid out as you would like them to be, so that you do not have to try to remember or guess the exact placement. First things first, I like to start at the bottom corner of my blanket. It can be the right side or it can be the left side, but I like to start at one end and work my way up the entire height of the entire project. So here I have the bottom right square and the bottom center square, and I'm ready to join at the bottom and work my way up the entire height of the blanket. I'm going to take these two pieces of crochet, these two Afghan squares. This is actually a Tunisian crochet project I've had in the works for a long time now, and I am ready to attach these together. You're going to want to make sure that whatever color you're using for your joining squares, that you go ahead and do a single crochet around the actual square itself. This helps not only to hide the seam from where you're joining your squares, but it just helps to keep things nice and clean and put together. So what I've done first is I've gone around the square with the actual blue of this square pattern itself. I've gone one single crochet using that blue around, and then one single crochet border using the cream or the tan. I've done the same thing with the green, to where I've crocheted the green square, and then I went around with a green edging, one row of single crochet, and now I'm ready. I've done my second row of the cream to go around as well. So I've got the bottom right and the bottom center. I'm starting at the bottom of my blanket, and I'm going to be seaming these squares straight up the entire height of the blanket. So I've got my connecting yarn color that I'm going to be using here. This is Vanna's Choice from Lion Brand. I do have my crochet hook that I'm going to use to seam these using the slip stitch, and I've got 3 stitch markers, one for the top, one for the center, and one for the bottom. Stitch markers in my method here are very important, and they make sure that you are staying on track if your stitch counts don't necessarily match. It looks like this blue one has more stitches than the green one, and that's going to be very important here in a moment. What I like to do is place my squares right side together. So this is the bottom of both. This is the bottom here. So I'm going to place right sides together. Okay? So I'm going to be seaming this edge. You can see that it already looks like the blue has a lot more stitches than the green, and that is perfectly fine. A lot of times I see, questions on, oh, can I use or can I attach these even though they have different numbers of stitches? Absolutely, of course you can. So what I'm doing here, I am stitch marking the corner of these two squares together. Now I'm going to stitch mark the other corner together using my second stitch marker. And honestly, it does not matter which corner stitch you use, because we're going to be going into all of them. It can be this one or this one, it doesn't matter. We're going to be seaming them all, so it really is okay if you go into one or the other. Okay, so now as this is laying here, the blue really does have a lot more stitches on that edge. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to let it lay nice and flat, and I'm just going to pinch it somewhere in the middle, and I'm going to put a stitch marker in whatever stitches those end up being, right? This one here, and just whatever ends up being on the back side. Do not worry about how many stitches there are on each side. It does not matter. That's the beauty of this method. I'm going to leave my squares right sides touching so that I can connect them using slip stitches. So I've got my yarn here. Let me go ahead and pull some of my yarn. And part of the reason that I love the slip stitch method instead of the mattress stitch, if you've been following Heart Hook Home for a while, you know that I absolutely love the mattress stitch. It's my favorite way to join two pieces of crochet. This though, when I'm doing squares, specifically whether that's granny squares, Afghan squares, stitch sampler, etc., this is my favorite way to attach these squares. It's so fast, and if you screw up, you can pull it out in literally no time flat. With the mattress stitch, it takes you a while. So I'm going to insert my hook in the same spot as that first stitch marker right here. I'm going to go ahead and remove that. I'm going to pull up a loop with my yarn, and I'm going to leave this tail a little bit longer because I'm going to use this after I complete the blanket, after I put on the border, after I've done everything. Then I will go back and weave in these ends. I like to do it after I add the border because sometimes at the connecting part of these squares, you can get kind of a little funky hole or a little opening. If you wait until the very end to weave in this end, then you can take care of that strategically with your yarn needle. So I've gone ahead and pulled up a loop. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the outside loops only. I've gone through both loops of both of these stitches, so I've got 4 loops that I went through to pick up my first loop, right? But now, from now on, I'm going to go in the outside loop of this one and the outside loop of this one, and I'm just going to slip stitch. And I'm going to stay very, very loose on my slip stitching. I'm going to go ahead and do the next one, outside loop here, and outside loop here, and a very nice loosey-goosey slip stitch. You do not want to do these too tight. So, the reason that I have placed this stitch marker in the middle is because I'm going to continue slip stitching, and when I get to the middle, the goal is to have used as many stitches or to where it lines up perfectly within those about 6 inches or however many you've got there. Right? If you're doing tiny granny squares, that's perfectly fine. But you can see that the blue has more stitches, so every once in a while, I'm going to skip a stitch on the blue, and you'll never be able to tell, I promise. Go into the outside loop of this one and the outside loop of this one, and just do a slip stitch. Stay nice and loose. Outside loop of this one, outside loop of this one, and slip stitch. Now let's take a look. We need to start making sure that the blue is going to line up when we get to that stitch marker. So you can see that when I hold these two lined up, I could either go into this one or this one, right? And since I need to be using up more stitches on the blue than I do the green, I'm going to go into this stitch here. So I'm going to grab the outside loop of the green and the outside loop of this one, leaving that one unworked. You are never going to be able to tell when your blanket is complete. Go ahead and do your slip stitch. Not too tight, not too loose. And now you can see that I'm more back on track with how these stitches line up. Outside loop and outside loop, just like that. Outside loop, slip stitch. Now let's kind of lay these down, right? Because we want to make sure that we're using the same, that we're using the right stitch to where it will line up when we get to this stitch marker on my left hand. So I'm going to go ahead and skip this stitch as well. I don't like to do 2 skipped stitches in a row. I like to at least have 1 slip stitch in between any skipped stitches. So I'm going to go outside of this one, outside of this one. I'm going to make sure that my blues are lining up nicely. I think I'm going to go ahead and skip this one right here. So I'm going to go into the outside of this one, skip that one, and use the outside of this one. Slip stitch next 2. Let's make sure that we're still going to line up nicely when we get to the stitch marker. I am going to have to skip another one here because you can see now that we're getting closer, you can see that I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 on the green, and I've got 1, 2, 3. Oh, look, we've got 4. Let's go ahead and slip stitch all the way to that stitch marker. And I cannot stress enough that you need to remain pretty loose in these slip stitches. If you do them too tight, then it will pucker, and it's easy to do. It's very easy to do, easier than you would think. Okay, now that I've made it to the stitch marker and everything is nice and flat, you can see that I've used more stitches on the blue. Can you tell where I did those skips though? I don't think you can. Go ahead and remove the stitch marker when you get to the middle. And you're going to use the stitch marker at the end to help you make sure that you do that one correctly when you get all the way there. We are going to have to skip some blues on this side as well. So let's go ahead and make our way to that corner. I am going to skip the next stitch here. I'm going to go with the outside and the outside with that skipped one. Outside and outside. Every once in a while, make sure you kind of let it relax a little bit, because if you hold it too close or you kind of move it like this, you could end up at the end over here like this with way too many, and that's what you do want to avoid. So the whole point is to kind of let it relax as you're slip stitching every once in a while and skip stitches as needed. We're just slip stitching using the outside loops of both of these squares. I'm going to let it rest a little bit. And when it starts getting to where you could either go into, like this one here. I've got this loop on my green, and then I've got these two on my blue. So I could go into that one or this one. If I relax my square a little bit, you can see that I really probably should go into this one here. When you get close enough to the end, you can go ahead and count or line up and say, here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one, here, 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 here. So if I skip this one here, then all of the rest of my loops should line up perfectly to get me to the corner, right? Do not go too tight. Continue making your slip stitches all the way to the end. When you get to the last one, go ahead and remove your stitch marker. Let me do it with my other hand. And go through both loops of both squares. Only at the corner do I go through both loops of both squares. So you should be going through 4 here instead of the 2 as we've done the entire time. I do pull this one at the corner a little bit tighter because we want these corners to be nice and secure. So let's open this up and take a look at what our seam looks like from this side. I'm going to pull this just a little bit so that it's not going to come out. I'm going to flip this over and we're going to lay it flat. And look at how nice and even those joins are. And like we said, you cannot really tell at all where we skipped on those blues. And I promise you that once this blanket is made and put together and gone through the washer at least once, you're never going to be able to tell. So here is my yarn down here. I'm going to leave this and don't do anything with it. I'm going to put this back with right sides together, and now I'm going to grab the next 2 squares in that sequence. So this is the bottom right and this is the bottom center. Now I'm going to grab the middle right and the middle center because I only have 9 squares in this blanket. I'm going to grab the next 2 squares. So these 2 squares I have already seamed, and I am ready to add these 2 squares going straight up the center. So I'm going to put these right sides together just like we did the others. And I'm not going to pin on this corner because we're getting ready to go through that with this yarn where this is still attached. I am, however, going to pin the top corner or the top left corner, right, in the centermost stitch. And I'm going to pin in the center. So I'm going to lay this out. I'm going to shake it a little bit and let it nice and relax. And I'm going to just put a pin in the center going through this square and this square. And again, I'm not counting how many stitches are on each side. I don't care how many stitches there are. We're going to make it work. So put these back right sides together. Let's pull our yarn so that we're ready with our next batch of slip stitches. I'm going to find the centermost or the cornermost stitches on these 2 squares. And remember, on the corners is the only time we go through all 4 loops. 2 loops on this one, 2 loops on this one. I'm going to slip stitch these together, and those are ones that I'm going to pull nice and tight because this is a join and I want to make sure that those joins stay nice and secure. So now we're going to do exactly what we just did on this side over here for the duration of these 2 squares. So I'm going to kind of let it relax a little bit. And I'm just going to kind of hold it very carefully, very lightly. And I'm going through the outside 2 loops for the entire duration until I get to that next corner. Now that I'm getting kind of close to this edge, I'm going to make sure that whatever I've got here is going to line up. Looks like I have 1 more on the back than I do the front. So I'm somewhere in here I'm going to have to skip again. And I'm just going to do that whenever it lines up conveniently. I'm not going to ever force anything to happen, just when it lines up conveniently. Perfect. And now we get to the end here. Let's take our stitch marker out, maybe, and go through both loops on both squares, just like that. Lovely. Now if we look at this one, look at how nicely this one lined up. Doesn't that look lovely? Beautiful. So now I've got my bottom 2, my middle 2, and I'm going to grab my top 2 and do the same exact thing. And then we are going to work on how to assemble the project going the opposite direction, because we've gone straight up now, but then we're going to need to go across and line them up and sew through or secure the center of those as well. So I'm going to continue, and then we will seam up the insides together. So here I have made it all the way to the top of my last square. Since mine is only 3 squares tall and 3 squares wide, I'm going to go ahead and clip off my yarn here with my yarn scissors, and I am definitely not going to weave that end in either. I'm going to leave all of my seaming tails open until after I complete the border. So now that I have seamed all of my seams going in this direction, I need to do them in this direction across the blanket as well. What I'm going to do is since these are already connected at this corner, I'm just going to lay it flat and put a stitch marker in the center of both of those squares, and I'm going to insert my hook on the far right corner, or left if you're left-handed. Now I'm going to do the same exact thing that I've done this entire time, in that I'm going to go across, skipping stitches as needed so that it lines up when I get to the stitch marker. And the only difference here is that when we get to where they join at the corners, we're going to go through both corners on both sides. It helps to keep those corners really secure. So I'm going to go ahead and start my slip stitching. And one thing that I forgot to mention at the beginning of this video is that sometimes it's really helpful if you go up a hook size or 2, because it is so imperative that you stay loose while you're making these slip stitches. So I went through both loops of both squares, all 4. Now I'm going to make sure I leave this tail a little bit longer so that I can weave that in after my border has been added. And now I'm just going to continue doing my slip stitches using the outside loops only, like this, all the way until I get to the stitch marker. Remember to stay nice and loose. I didn't get that whole stitch. Yes, I did. Stay nice and loose the entire time. As I am approaching the join here where these squares line up, I am just going to continue doing my slip stitches until I run out. And now that I've made it here, I am going to use the same 2 that I used when I did this perpendicular slip stitching. I'm going to go into both sides of that, both sides of both squares. So I've got all 4 loops here. Again, anytime where a square intersects with each other, I'm going to go through all of the available loops that I can to make sure that it is nice and secure. So I've done it on the right side of my seam here. I'm going to do it on the left side of my seam here, and then I'm just going to continue working across. This one at the joins of the squares where they intersect, I do make that slip stitch just a little bit more tight because I want to make sure that it's not going anywhere. Especially the second one that lays on top of the actual join there. I want to make sure that that is nice and secure. I'm going to do my first outside loop slip stitch of the next 2 squares. And before I continue on, I am going to lay down these next 2, right? And I'm going to find the center again of the next square. So I'm going to just kind of lay it down nice and make sure that we are going somewhere in the middle there. I'm going to pin these together with my stitch marker. And now I'm ready to continue on doing my slip stitch all the way across. Let me get a few stitches past this, and then we can look at the seam on the front side and see how it looks. So here we are looking at the front of this seam, and you can see that everything is nice and secure, that it's not going anywhere. If I pull on these to pull it apart, those squares are definitely secure and they are not going anywhere. I'm going to go ahead and continue seaming all the way across, and this is my favorite way to join two pieces of crochet. Don't those just look beautiful? How these nice seam right here is just so clean and so pretty. You will never be able to tell that I skipped all of those stitches in the center where I was doing that, which is absolutely the goal here. I hope you enjoyed this square seaming video and that this makes your next project, seaming two squares together, much easier. Thanks for watching, and I'll check you next time.